My son-in-law slammed the table and shouted, "Either you hand over your savings to us, or go live on the street." I stayed quiet and just shook my head. A week later, the surprise I had prepared left him breathless. He barely saw my revenge coming. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached." Chapter 1. The Silent Humiliation. I never thought my own dining room would become a courtroom where I'd be sentenced without trial. The afternoon sun filtered through the lace curtains my late wife Margaret had hung 20 years ago, casting gentle patterns on the oak table where we'd shared countless family dinners. But there was nothing gentle about what was happening now. Marcus sat across from me, his jaw clenched tight, his fingers drumming impatiently on the polished wood. My daughter Sarah perched beside him, her eyes avoiding mine, fidgeting with her wedding ring like she always did when she was nervous. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. "Harold," Marcus finally said, his voice carrying that edge I'd grown to recognize over the past 6 months. "We need to talk." I set down my coffee cup carefully, the ceramic making a soft clink against the saucer. At 61, I'd learned that rushing into conversations rarely led anywhere good. "I'm listening." Marcus leaned forward, his elbows on the table in a way that Margaret would have gently corrected. "Sarah and I are in a tough spot, real tough. The unemployment benefits ran out last month and we're behind on everything. Rent, car payments, credit cards." I nodded slowly, my weathered hands wrapped around the warm mug. I'd built houses for 43 years before retiring, saved every penny I could, lived modestly in the same house Margaret and I had bought as newlyweds. The money sitting in my accounts wasn't just paper and numbers. It was every early morning, every aching back, every sacrifice Margaret and I had made. "I've been looking for work," Marcus continued, though something in his tone made my chest tighten. "But the market's tough, and with my experience level." "What kind of help are you looking for?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. Sarah finally looked up, her blue eyes, so much like her mother's, rimmed with tears. "Daddy, we just need a little help to get back on our feet. Maybe you could lend us some money from your savings." The word lend hung in the air like a lie we all knew but pretended to believe. I'd lent money to Sarah before, for her wedding, for Marcus's last business venture, for emergencies that seemed to multiply like weeds. None of it had ever been repaid, and we'd all silently agreed to pretend that was normal. "How much are we talking about?" I asked. Marcus's eyes lit up, and he straightened in his chair. "Well, to really get clear of everything, we'd need about 60,000. I know it sounds like a lot, but 60,000? The number hit me like a physical blow. That was nearly half of everything I had left after Margaret's medical bills. "It's not forever," Sarah rushed to explain. "Once Marcus gets a good job, we'll pay you back." "We will, Daddy. We just need time." I stared at my daughter, this woman who'd once been a little girl with pigtails, who'd sit on my lap while I read her bedtime stories. When had she learned to lie so smoothly? When had desperation carved those lines around her eyes? "I need to think about this," I said quietly. Marcus's demeanor shifted instantly. The pleading mask slipped, revealing something harder underneath. "Think about what?" "Your daughter needs help. Your own daughter." "Marcus," Sarah whispered, placing a warning hand on his arm, but he was past warnings now. He stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the hardwood floor with a harsh screech. "No, Sarah. I'm tired of tiptoeing around this." He turned to me, his face flushed with anger and something else. "Entitlement. You're sitting on a pile of money you'll never spend. You live alone in this big house, eating the same meals, watching the same TV shows, while your daughter is struggling, while we might lose everything." My heart began to pound, but I kept my voice level. "I worked hard for that money." "And what good is it doing anyone just sitting in the bank?" Marcus shot back. "You're 61, Harold. How many years do you have left to enjoy it?" "But Sarah, she's young. She has her whole life ahead of her. We could use that money to build something, to create a future." The audacity of it took my breath away. He was talking about my death like it was a business opportunity, calculating the years I had left like interest rates. "I said I need to think about it," I repeated, my voice quieter but firmer. Marcus slammed his palm down on the table so hard that my coffee cup jumped, spilling dark liquid across the wood. The sharp crack echoed through the room like a gunshot. "Think about what?" he roared, his face now crimson. "Your daughter is telling you she needs help and you want to think about it. What kind of father are you? Sarah flinched at the sound, but she didn't tell him to stop. She just sat there, letting him tear into me with words that cut deeper than any physical blow. Marcus leaned down, his face inches from mine, his breath hot with anger. Let me make this real simple for you, old man. Either you hand over that money, our inheritance, or you can figure out how to take care of yourself, because we won't be coming around anymore. You want to be selfish? Fine, be selfish alone. He straightened up, his chest heaving. Either you help your family or you can go live on the street for all I care. But don't expect us to keep pretending we're one big happy family when you've made it clear where your priorities are. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the old grandfather clock in the hallway ticking away the seconds, each one feeling like an eternity. My hands trembled slightly as I reached for a napkin to clean up the spilled coffee. Daddy? Sarah's voice was small, uncertain. I looked at her, this stranger wearing my daughter's face, and something inside me went very cold and very quiet. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I didn't point out that Marcus had just threatened to abandon me if I didn't pay him. I simply nodded. I understand, I said softly. Marcus smiled then, a triumphant expression that made my stomach turn. Good. We'll need the money by next week. I'll bring the paperwork by tomorrow so we can make it official. They left shortly after, Marcus strutting out like he'd won some great victory, Sarah following behind with her head down. I sat alone at my kitchen table, staring at the coffee stain on the wood, listening to their car drive away. But Marcus had made one crucial mistake. He'd assumed that silence meant surrender. He'd mistaken my calm for weakness, my thoughtfulness for defeat. What he didn't understand was that 43 years in construction had taught me something valuable. The strongest foundations are built quietly, methodically, and with great care. As I cleaned up the spilled coffee, my mind was already working, planning, calculating. Marcus wanted to play games with contracts and paperwork. Perfect. He just challenged a man who'd spent 4 decades reading the fine print, who'd learned that the devil wasn't just in the details. Sometimes, he was the details. The house felt different now, charged with a new energy. Margaret's pictures smiled down at me from the mantelpiece, and I could almost hear her voice. Harold, that boy's got more greed than sense. Be careful. I would be careful, very careful, but I wouldn't be the victim in this story. Chapter 2. The Devastating Discovery. 3 days passed before Marcus returned with his paperwork. 3 days during which I did what any careful man does when facing a major decision. I investigated. It started innocently enough. I called my neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, whose husband worked at the same manufacturing plant where Marcus had been employed. "Oh, Harold," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "didn't Sarah tell you? Marcus wasn't laid off. He was fired, caught stealing copper wire from the warehouse. The company didn't press charges, but word gets around." The first crack in Marcus's story sent a chill down my spine. If he'd lied about losing his job, what else had he lied about? I spent the next morning at the public library, using their computers to search through public records and business filings. What I found made my blood run cold. Marcus hadn't just lost one job. He'd been fired from 3 positions in the past 2 years, each time for theft or fraud. Each time he'd convinced Sarah it was downsizing or corporate restructuring. But the worst discovery came that afternoon when I drove past Sarah's apartment complex. I'd planned to stop by, maybe take her to lunch like we used to do before Marcus came into the picture. Instead, I saw something that shattered my heart into pieces. Sarah was standing by the mailboxes, crying. Not the gentle tears of frustration I'd seen the other day, but the deep, wrenching sobs of someone whose world was falling apart. An older woman, Mrs. Kowalski, the building manager, had her arm around Sarah's shoulders. I parked and approached quietly, close enough to hear their conversation but hidden behind another car. "Honey, I can't give you any more extensions," Mrs. Kowalski was saying gently. "You're 4 months behind on rent. If you can't come up with at least half by Friday, I have to start eviction proceedings." "I know," Sarah choked out. "I'm trying. My dad has money, but he's being difficult about helping us." My chest tightened. That wasn't what had happened at all. "Where's your husband?" Mrs. Kowalski asked. "Why isn't he working?" Sarah's sob caught in her throat. He says he's looking, but I found out yesterday that he's been lying to me. He wasn't laid off from his last job. He was fired. For stealing. The words hit me like a physical blow. Sarah knew. She knew Marcus was a thief, Knew he'd lied to her, and yet she'd sat in my dining room and helped him demand my life savings. "Oh, sweetheart," Mrs. Kowalski murmured. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know." Sarah's voice was so small, so broken. "Marcus says it's not his fault. He says the companies were looking for someone to blame, that they picked on him because he's not college educated. He says if Dad would just help us out, we could start fresh somewhere else." "And you believe him?" There was a long pause. When Sarah spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. "I have to believe him. If I don't, if I admit that I married a man who lies and steals, what does that make me?" I wanted to go to her then, to wrap my arms around my little girl and tell her that it made her human, that we all make mistakes, that love sometimes blinds us to the truth. But before I could move, I heard footsteps. Marcus rounded the corner, carrying a six-pack of beer and whistling. Even from a distance, I could see the smug satisfaction on his face. He'd sent his wife to beg the landlord for more time while he bought beer with money they didn't have. "Sarah," he called out cheerfully, "did you talk to the old man? Tell him how desperate we are?" Sarah wiped her eyes quickly. "Not yet. I was just—" "Well, what are you waiting for?" Marcus interrupted, his tone shifting to irritation. "Call him, cry a little. Daughters are supposed to be daddy's little princesses, right? Use that." My hands clenched into fists. He was coaching my daughter to manipulate me, teaching her to weaponize her tears. "Marcus, maybe we should try other options," Sarah said hesitantly. "Maybe you could look for work while we wait." "While we wait for what?" Marcus snapped. "For your father to decide whether his only daughter is worth helping. The old bastard is sitting on a fortune while we're about to be homeless." Mrs. Kowalski stepped forward, her voice firm. "Young man, there's no need for that language." Marcus barely glanced at her. "Stay out of this, lady. This is family business." "Marcus, please," Sarah pleaded. "You're making a scene." "I'm making a scene?" Marcus's voice rose. "Your father is the one making a scene, hoarding money while his daughter suffers. You know what I think? I think the old man likes having power over us, likes watching us beg." The cruelty in his words took my breath away. But what shattered me completely was what came next. Sarah looked up at him with such desperate hope in her eyes. "But he'll help us, right? Eventually, he has to. I'm his daughter." Marcus's expression softened into something that might have looked like love to someone who didn't know better. "Of course he will, baby. And when he does, we'll be set. Think about it. He's old, he lives alone, he won't live forever. All that money will be ours eventually anyway. We're just asking him to help us now instead of making us wait for him to die." The callousness of it stole the air from my lungs. They weren't just planning to take my money, they were planning for my death, calculating it like a business transaction. But Sarah's response was what truly broke my heart. She didn't recoil in horror. She didn't tell him that was a terrible thing to say. Instead, she nodded slowly, as if his logic made perfect sense. "You're right," she whispered. "It's not like he needs all that money. What's he going to do with it? He doesn't travel, doesn't buy anything nice for himself. At least we would use it to build a life." I pressed my back against the car, feeling like I might be sick. This was my daughter, my little girl, talking about my death like it was an overdue bill. Marcus wrapped his arm around Sarah's shoulders, pulling her close. "That's my smart girl. Now go call Daddy and tell him how scared you are, how much you need him. And Sarah," he tilted her chin up to look at him, "don't mention what I said about his job, okay? Let him think I'm just down on my luck. Men like your father, they like to feel superior. Give him that." I watched my daughter nod obediently, watched her pull out her phone with shaking hands. As the first ring echoed in the afternoon air, I slipped away quietly, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. On the drive home, the pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Marcus hadn't lost his job. He'd been fired for stealing. The debt wasn't from bad luck. It was from his choices. And my daughter, my precious Sarah, had become his willing accomplice in a scheme to rob me of everything I'd worked for. But more than that, I'd heard something in their conversation that chilled me to the bone. This wasn't just about the $60,000. This was about positioning themselves for my death, about making sure they'd inherit everything when I was gone. Marcus was playing a longer game than I'd realized. That evening, as I sat in my study surrounded by 43 years of careful financial planning, I made a decision. If Marcus wanted to play games with paperwork and contracts, if he wanted to treat my life and death like a business opportunity, then I would show him what 4 decades of reading the fine print had taught me. The phone rang. Sarah's name appeared on the caller ID, and I knew what was coming. Another performance, another plea, another lie wrapped in tears and desperation. But this time, I was ready for him. Chapter 3. The silent game begins. The phone call came exactly as I'd predicted. Sarah's voice was thick with tears, each word carefully crafted to tug at my heartstrings. She painted a picture of desperation, eviction notices, utility shutoffs, Marcus working tirelessly to find employment. Every lie Marcus had coached her to tell flowed from her lips like a rehearsed script. "Daddy, I'm so scared," she whispered into the phone. "I don't know what we're going to do. Marcus is trying so hard, but companies just aren't hiring. We just need a little help to get back on our feet." I listened in silence, my heart breaking not for their fictional crisis, but for what my daughter had become. When she finished her performance, I took a deep breath. "Sarah, honey, you know I love you more than life itself." "I know, Daddy. I love you too." "Then come over tomorrow evening. Bring Marcus. We'll figure something out." The relief in her voice was genuine, even if everything else had been fabricated. "Really?" "Oh, Daddy, thank you so much. We'll be there at 7. After hanging up, I spent the rest of the evening in my study, crafting what would become Marcus's downfall. 43 years of construction work had taught me that the strongest traps are built with careful precision and infinite patience. The next evening arrived with an autumn chill that reminded me of Margaret. She'd loved this time of year, the way the leaves turned gold and red before falling to earth. I found myself wondering what she'd think of what I was about to do, but then I remembered her fierce protectiveness when it came to people taking advantage of others, and I knew she'd understand. Marcus arrived wearing his best shirt and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Sarah clung to his arm like a life preserver, hope radiating from every pore. They sat in the same spots as before, but this time the atmosphere was different. This time, I held all the cards. "I've been thinking about what you said." I began slowly, pouring coffee from Margaret's good china service. "About family helping family." Marcus leaned forward eagerly. "And? You're right. Families should support each other through difficult times." I set the coffee pot down carefully. "That's why I've decided to help you." Sarah's face lit up with pure joy. "Daddy, really?" "Really." I reached into my shirt pocket and pulled out a folded document. "However, there are conditions." Marcus's smile faltered slightly, but he nodded. "Of course, whatever you need." I unfolded the papers slowly, deliberately. "This is a formal loan agreement. It outlines the terms of the $60,000 you're requesting." "A loan agreement?" Marcus's voice carried a note of suspicion. "Yes. You see, Marcus, I've been thinking about what you said. About building something, creating a future. A loan between family members should be properly documented. For tax purposes, you understand, and to protect everyone involved." Sarah reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "That makes perfect sense, Daddy. We want everything to be proper." Marcus was studying the papers now, his brow furrowed. I could see him trying to process the legal language, the clauses and subclauses that meant nothing to him but everything to me. "This seems complicated," he said finally. "Not really." I leaned back in my chair, my voice conversational. "It's fairly standard. The loan amount, repayment terms, interest rate, all perfectly reasonable. 5% annually, which is quite generous in today's market." "Interest?" Marcus looked up sharply. "Well, of course. This is a business transaction, isn't it? Even family loans require proper documentation for the IRS." I kept my tone light, matter of fact. "The agreement also includes standard protections for both parties." Marcus was flipping through the pages now, clearly overwhelmed by the legal terminology. "What kind of protections?" "Oh, the usual things. Collateral requirements, default provisions, acceleration clauses." I waved my hand dismissively. Standard boilerplate language that any legitimate business loan would include. "Collateral?" Sarah's voice was small. "Just a formality, sweetheart. The agreement requires some form of security for the loan. In this case, Marcus would need to list his assets, vehicles, personal property, that sort of thing. Again, it's standard practice." What I didn't explain was that the standard practice language I'd included would make Marcus personally liable for the entire debt, with his future earnings and any assets as collateral. The acceleration clause meant that if he missed even one payment, the entire amount would become due immediately, and the default provisions, well, those were particularly creative. Marcus was sweating now, the papers trembling slightly in his hands. "This is a lot to read through. Maybe I should take it to someone who understands legal documents." "Of course," I said cheerfully. "Take all the time you need, though I should mention that the offer is time sensitive. If you're facing facing eviction as soon as you say, we'll need to move quickly. Sarah turned to Marcus, her eyes wide with panic. Marcus, we don't have time to wait. Mrs. Kowalski said we have until Friday. I know, but please. Sarah's voice cracked. We can trust Daddy. He's trying to help us. Marcus looked between the papers and my daughter's pleading face. I could see the war playing out in his mind. Greed battling caution, desperation fighting suspicion. But Marcus had one fatal flaw. He thought he was smarter than everyone else. You know what? He said finally, reaching for the pen I'd placed conspicuously on the table. You're right, Sarah. Your father is looking out for us. And honestly, Harold, I appreciate you being so thorough. It shows you take this seriously. I take family very seriously, I replied, and for the first time in days, I meant every word. Marcus signed with a flourish, his signature bold and confident. He had no idea he'd just signed away his future. Excellent. I took the papers back, checking the signature carefully. I'll have the funds transferred to your account tomorrow morning. Sarah threw her arms around my neck, tears of gratitude streaming down her face. Thank you, Daddy. Thank you so much. You're saving our lives. If only she knew what I was really saving her from. Marcus shook my hand firmly, his grip confident and strong. This means everything to us, Harold. You won't regret this. I'm sure I won't, I replied quietly. They left that evening in high spirits, already making plans for how they'd use the money. Marcus talked about paying off their debts and maybe taking a small vacation while he looked for work. Sarah chattered about finally being able to sleep without worrying about eviction notices. I watched their taillights disappear into the darkness, then returned to my study. The signed loan agreement sat on my desk like a loaded weapon, every clause and provision carefully designed for maximum impact. Marcus thought he'd won. He thought he'd successfully manipulated an old man into handing over his life savings. What he didn't understand was that I'd spent 4 decades in an industry where a single misread contract could cost millions. I'd learned to read between the lines, to spot the traps hidden in innocent-looking language. And now, Marcus had walked willingly into the most elegant trap I'd ever constructed. The money would be transferred as promised. Marcus would pay off his immediate debts, feel secure and victorious. He'd probably stop looking for legitimate work, confident that he'd found an easier path, and that's when the beautiful precision of contract law would begin to unfold. I poured myself a glass of Margaret's favorite wine and raised it toward her photograph. This one's for you, sweetheart. You always said that pride comes before the fall. Marcus's fall was going to be spectacular, but first I had to let him climb a little higher. The view from the top would make the descent that much more devastating. Outside, the autumn wind rattled the windows and I smiled. Winter was coming, and Marcus had no idea how cold it was about to get. Chapter 4. The Trap closes. For 6 weeks, Marcus lived like a king. He paid off the back rent with great fanfare, settled the credit card debts, and even bought Sarah a new dress for what he called their financial independence celebration. He strutted around town like a man who'd beaten the system, telling anyone who'd listen about his generous father-in-law and how family connections could solve any problem. What Marcus didn't know was that I was watching, waiting, documenting. Mrs. Henderson kept me informed about his daily routines, sleeping until noon, spending afternoons at Murphy's bar, placing bets on football games with money that wasn't his. Mrs. Kowalski called to tell me he'd been bragging to other tenants about how easy it had been to convince the old man to open his wallet. But the most damning evidence came from Sarah herself during what she thought was a casual phone call. Daddy, I just wanted to thank you again for helping us out. Marcus feels so much better about everything now. Is he having any luck with job interviews? I asked innocently. There was a pause. Well, he's been networking, meeting with people in the industry, exploring opportunities. Networking at Murphy's bar, exploring opportunities at the horse track. The lies came so easily now that I wondered if Sarah even recognized them as lies anymore. That's good, I said. Remind him that the first payment is due in 8 weeks. Another pause, longer this time. First payment. The loan payment, sweetheart. It's all in the contract Marcus signed. Monthly payments of $850, starting December 1st. The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Finally, Sarah cleared her throat. I'm sure Marcus has that all planned out. He's very organized about financial matters. After hanging up, I allowed myself a small smile. Marcus had clearly never mentioned the payment schedule to Sarah, probably figured he'd deal with that later, maybe squeeze another loan out of the old man when the time came. But December 1st arrived with the punctuality of winter itself. I was having my morning coffee when the phone rang. Marcus's voice was different now, harder, more aggressive than the grateful son-in-law who'd shaken my hand 6 weeks earlier. "Harold, we need to talk about this payment thing." "Payment thing?" I kept my voice mild, interested. "This $850 a month, that's not going to work." "I'm sorry, I don't understand." "That's what we agreed to when you signed the contract." "Look, I'm still between jobs. The employment market is tougher than we thought. We need more time." I set down my coffee cup carefully. "How much more time?" 6 months, maybe a year, until I can get established in a good position." "A year?" I let concern creep into my voice. "Marcus, that would put you in violation of the loan agreement." "Violation?" His laugh was forced, nervous. "Come on, Harold, we're family. Surely we can work something out." "I'm afraid it's not that simple. You see, the contract you signed includes specific default provisions. If you miss even one payment, the acceleration clause kicks in." "Acceleration clause?" "The entire loan becomes due immediately, all $60,000, plus accrued interest and penalties." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. I could practically hear the gears grinding in Marcus's head as he processed what I'd just told him. That can't be right," he said finally. "No one would sign something like that." "You did sign it, Marcus. Your signature is right there on page 3, paragraph 7. Would you like me to read it to you?" "I want to see a lawyer." "Of course, that's your right. Though I should mention that the contract also includes provisions for legal fees. If you challenge the agreement and lose, you'll be responsible for my attorney costs as well." Another long silence. When Marcus spoke again, his voice was tight with barely controlled rage. "What the hell kind of game are you playing, old man?" "I'm not playing any games, Marcus. I'm simply following the terms of a legally binding contract that you signed willingly. A contract, I might add, that you had every opportunity to review before signing. You know I didn't understand all that legal bullshit. And perhaps you should have consulted an attorney before signing. That's what I would have done." I could hear him breathing heavily, could picture his face reddening with anger and desperation. "What do you want from me?" "I want exactly what the contract specifies. $850 by December 1st, or the full amount becomes due immediately." "And if I can't pay?" I paused, letting the weight of the question settle. "Then I'll have no choice but to pursue collection through legal channels. The contract allows for garnishment of wages, seizure of assets, and liens against any property you might own or acquire in the future." "You bastard." The words came out as a hiss. "You planned this whole thing." "I planned to help my daughter and her husband through a difficult time. If you're unable to honor your obligations, that's not my fault. Sarah's going to hear about this. She's going to know what kind of man her father really is." "Sarah already knows what kind of man I am, Marcus. The question is whether she knows what kind of man you are." The line went dead. 3 hours later, Sarah was at my door. Her face was streaked with tears, her eyes red and swollen. But behind the grief, I saw something I hadn't seen in months. Clarity. "Daddy," she said quietly, stepping into the hallway without being invited. "We need to talk." We sat in the living room, the same room where this whole mess had started. But Sarah was different now. The desperate, manipulated woman who'd begged for my money was gone, replaced by someone who looked tired and older, but infinitely wiser. "Marcus told me about the contract," she said. And he told me you trapped him, that you deliberately wrote it in a way he wouldn't understand." I nodded. "What do you think?" Sarah was quiet for a long time, staring at her hands. "I think," she said finally, "that Marcus had 6 weeks to read that contract. 6 weeks to ask questions or hire a lawyer. 6 weeks to tell me about the payment terms." "Did he tell you?" "No." Her voice was barely a whisper. "He didn't tell me anything. He just spent the money like it was free." She looked up at me, her eyes clear for the first time in months. "Daddy, I found something today. Something Marcus didn't know I knew about." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small notebook. "Marcus has been keeping track of things. Your address, your schedule, your bank information. He's been planning something, Daddy. Something bigger than just the loan." My blood ran cold. What kind of planning? He's been researching your medical history, your prescriptions. He's been asking questions about your will, about who handles your finances. Sarah's voice shook. I think he's been planning for you to die, Daddy. Planning for it to happen sooner rather than later. The notebook fell from her trembling hands, pages scattering across the coffee table. Among them, I saw photocopies of my prescription bottles, notes about my daily routines, and most chilling of all, research about how to contest a will on grounds of mental incompetency. Oh, sweetheart, I said softly, reaching for her hand. I'm so sorry you had to discover this. I married a monster, she whispered, and I helped him hurt you. Daddy, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. As I held my daughter while she cried, I realized that my carefully laid trap had caught something more valuable than Marcus's greed. It had caught the truth, and sometimes the truth was worth more than any revenge. Chapter 5. The Fall of the Manipulator. The evidence spread across my coffee table told a story more sinister than I'd ever imagined. Marcus hadn't just been planning to steal my money. He'd been methodically researching how to steal my life. The notebook Sarah had found contained detailed observations about my health, my habits, even notes about which of my medications might be accidentally increased or mixed with alcohol. Sarah sat beside me on the couch, her face pale as we examined page after page of her husband's calculations. This one, she said, her voice shaking as she pointed to a particular entry. He wrote down when you take your heart medication, what time you usually go to bed, how often you check your doors at night. I studied Marcus's handwriting, neat and methodical, like a hunter tracking prey. How long has he been keeping this? I found it hidden in his toolbox 2 days ago. The earliest entries are from right after we got married. Sarah's laugh was bitter and broken. He's been planning this for over a year, Daddy. Everything. The job losses, the debt, even marrying me. It was all part of some sick, long-term plan. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Marcus hadn't fallen into crime. He'd chosen it as a career path. And my daughter had been nothing more than his entry point into my life. Sarah, listen to me carefully, I said, taking her hands in mine. Where is Marcus now? At Murphy's bar. He said he needed to think, needed to figure out how to handle the old man problem. She shuddered. That's what he called you, Daddy, the old man problem. I stood up, my mind racing. Marcus was desperate now, cornered and dangerous. Men like him didn't surrender gracefully. They escalated. We need to get you somewhere safe, I said. Safe? Sarah looked confused. Why would I need to be safe? Before I could answer, car doors slammed in my driveway. Through the window, I saw Marcus stumbling toward the house, clearly drunk, with 2 men I didn't recognize flanking him. One was tall and thin with prison tattoos covering his arms. The other was shorter but built like a boxer, his face scarred and hard. Sarah, go upstairs and lock yourself in the bathroom, I said quietly, my construction worker instincts kicking in. Dangerous situations required calm action, not panic. What? No, I'm not leaving you. Go, now. The authority in my voice cut through her confusion, and she obeyed without further argument. The pounding on my front door started before she'd reached the top of the stairs. Not knocking, pounding, the kind of aggressive assault that meant business. I opened the door slowly, keeping my body in the frame to block their view of the interior. Marcus stood swaying on my porch, reeking of alcohol and desperation. His 2 companions looked like they'd stepped out of a police lineup. Harold, Marcus slurred, pushing past me into my hallway. We need to settle this thing right now. Marcus, you're drunk. Go home and sleep it off. We can talk tomorrow. No! He spun around, his coordination off, but his anger crystal clear. No more talking. No more games. You think you're so smart with your contracts and your legal bullshit, but you forgot something important. The 2 men followed him inside without invitation. The tall one closed the door behind them, while the shorter one positioned himself near the stairs. They moved with the practiced efficiency of people who'd done this before. What did I forget? I asked, keeping my voice steady. Marcus smiled, and it was the ugliest expression I'd ever seen. You forgot that some problems can't be solved with paperwork. The tall man stepped forward. Mr. Holloway, your son-in-law here owes some people money. Important people. And since he can't pay, and since you're the one holding up his cash flow, those people are looking to you for satisfaction. I don't know what Marcus told you, but he told us you're sitting on a pile of money while your family suffers. The shorter man interrupted. His voice was soft, almost conversational, which somehow made it more menacing. That doesn't seem very neighborly. Marcus pulled out a fresh set of papers from his jacket. "This here's a new agreement, Harold. Much simpler than that legal garbage you tried to pull. You sign this, you transfer the full 60,000 plus another 40 for my trouble, and we all walk away happy." I glanced at the papers. They were crude, handwritten, barely legal, but they would hold up long enough for Marcus to empty my accounts and disappear. "And if I don't sign?" The tall man cracked his knuckles. "Well, sometimes old folks have accidents, slips and falls, heart attacks brought on by stress. Real sad, but these things happen. Especially to stubborn old men who don't know when to cooperate," the shorter man added. I looked at Marcus. This man my daughter had loved, had trusted, had defended. "Is this really what you want, Marcus? To threaten your wife's father?" "Sarah doesn't have to know," Marcus said, his words slurring together. "You sign the papers, transfer the money, and tell her you decided to help us out after all. She'll be grateful, happy, and you get to keep breathing." "And if I refuse?" Marcus's smile widened. "Then Sarah gets to be a very wealthy widow. Either way, I get what I'm owed." The casual way he discussed my murder, Sarah's grief, sent ice through my veins. But 43 years of construction work had taught me something these men hadn't counted on: how to read a building's weaknesses and use them to your advantage. "You know what, Marcus? You're right." I moved slowly toward my desk, hands visible, non-threatening. "I've been stubborn and selfish. Family should help family." The three men relaxed slightly, convinced that fear had won where greed had failed. "That's more like it," Marcus said. "See, we can work this out like civilized people." I opened my desk drawer, but instead of reaching for a pen, I pressed the small red button hidden under the lip of the desktop, a button I'd had installed 3 years ago when the neighborhood started changing, when break-ins became more common. The button triggered a silent alarm that went directly to the police station. It also activated recording devices I'd had installed throughout the house after Margaret's death. Partly for security, partly because living alone made me paranoid about medical emergencies. Every word of their threats, every detail of their extortion attempt was being recorded and transmitted. "Just need to get a pen," I said calmly, reaching into the drawer again. This time I pulled out the .38 revolver I'd kept there since retiring. Not for heroics, not for dramatic confrontations, but for exactly this situation, when calm negotiation was no longer an option. The mood in the room changed instantly. "Whoa now," the tall man said, raising his hands. "Let's not do anything stupid, old man." "I agree completely," I said, keeping the gun pointed at the floor but clearly visible. "That's why you three are going to leave my house right now, and Marcus is going to honor the contract he signed." "You can't shoot all three of us," the shorter man said, but he was backing toward the door. "Maybe not," I admitted, "but I can definitely shoot Marcus, and since he's the one who owes you money, I imagine that would complicate your collection efforts considerably." Marcus's face had gone white. "Harold, be reasonable. We can work this out." "We already worked it out, Marcus. You signed a contract. Honor it, or face the consequences." The sound of sirens in the distance was faint but growing stronger. The tall man heard them first, his head snapping toward the window. "Cops," he said tersely. "We're gone." They headed for the door, but I stopped them with my voice. "Gentlemen, if I see you on my property again, if you contact my daughter, if you so much as drive down my street, I will assume you're here to finish what you started tonight, and I will defend myself accordingly." The shorter man paused at the door. "This ain't over, old man." "Yes, it is," I said quietly. "Marcus's debt is his problem, not mine. And if anything happens to me or my daughter, the police will know exactly where to start looking." They left as quickly as they'd arrived, but Marcus hesitated in the doorway. "You think you've won," he said, his voice thick with rage and alcohol. "But Sarah will never forgive you for this. You've destroyed her marriage." "No, Marcus," I said sadly. "You destroyed her marriage the day you decided to use her as bait in your con game." The police arrived 5 minutes later, followed closely by my attorney David, whom I'd called as soon as the alarm was triggered. The recording devices had captured everything: the threats, the extortion attempt, Marcus's casual discussion of my murder. As Marcus was led away in handcuffs, he screamed back at the house, "Sarah! Sarah, don't let him do this to me, I love you." But Sarah wasn't listening anymore. She stood beside me on the porch, watching the man she'd married reveal his true nature for all the world to see. "It's over," she said quietly. Not a question, a statement of fact. "Yes," I agreed. "It's finally over." Chapter 6. the peace deserved. 6 months after Marcus's arrest, I sat in my favorite chair, watching the morning sun filter through Margaret's lace curtains. The house felt different now, lighter somehow, as if a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying had finally been lifted. Sarah was in the kitchen making coffee, humming softly to herself. It was a sound I hadn't heard in over 2 years, not since Marcus had systematically erased the joy from her life. The divorce had been finalized 3 weeks ago, and while the legal process had been painful, watching my daughter rediscover herself had been worth every difficult moment. "Daddy," she called from the kitchen, "do you want cream in your coffee?" "Just a splash," I called back, smiling at the normalcy of it. These small domestic moments had become precious to me, evidence that we'd survived Marcus's poison and found our way back to being a family. The morning newspaper lay folded on my lap, its headline buried on page 6. Local man sentenced to 7 years for extortion. The article was brief, clinical in its description of Marcus's crimes. It mentioned his previous arrests, his pattern of targeting elderly victims, his use of romantic relationships to gain access to potential marks. What it didn't mention was how close he'd come to succeeding, how his plan might have worked if he'd been patient, if he'd been smarter, if he hadn't underestimated a man who'd spent 43 years reading contracts and understanding the fine print. Sarah appeared in the doorway carrying 2 steaming mugs. She'd gained back some of the weight she'd lost during her marriage, and the dark circles under her eyes had faded. She looked like my daughter again, not the hollow-eyed stranger Marcus had created. "Any regrets?" she asked, settling into Margaret's old chair across from me. I considered the question seriously. "About which part?" "Any of it. The trap you set for Marcus, the way it all ended." I took a sip of coffee, thinking about the man who'd threatened to kill me for money, who'd planned to murder me for an inheritance, who'd turned my daughter into an unwitting accomplice in his schemes. "None," I said finally. "Do you?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee. "I regret marrying him. I regret not seeing who he really was. I regret putting you through all of that." She looked up at me, her eyes clear and honest. "But I don't regret that he's gone." The relief in her voice was unmistakable. For months after Marcus's arrest, Sarah had wrestled with guilt. Guilt over her role in his plans, guilt over the relief she felt at his absence, guilt over the peace that had settled over our lives once he was removed from them. "He fooled a lot of people," I reminded her. "The police said you weren't his first victim. There were 3 other women before you, all with similar stories. He was good at what he did. Too good." Sarah shuddered. "When I think about what could have happened." We'd learned during the trial that Marcus's notebook contained more than just surveillance notes about me. There were detailed plans for staging my death as an accident, research into untraceable poisons, even a timeline for when and how he'd approach me about updating my will to ensure Sarah inherited everything. The prosecution had called it one of the most methodically planned elder abuse cases they'd ever seen. Marcus hadn't just been stealing money. He'd been orchestrating my murder with the cold precision of a professional killer. "But it didn't happen," I said firmly. "And now, he's where he belongs." Sarah nodded, then stood up suddenly. "I have something for you." She disappeared upstairs and returned carrying a small wooden box I recognized. It had been Margaret's jewelry box, a simple pine container I'd made for her during our first year of marriage. "I found this in Marcus's things when I was packing up the apartment," Sarah said, setting the box on the coffee table. He'd hidden it behind some books. I opened the box with trembling fingers. Inside were Margaret's wedding ring, her pearl necklace, her grandmother's silver bracelet, all the pieces that had gone missing during Marcus's early visits to our house. Pieces I'd assumed were misplaced in my grief, never imagining they'd been systematically stolen. "He was planning to sell them," Sarah said quietly. There were pawnshop estimates in his notebook. He'd researched their value down to the penny. I lifted Margaret's wedding ring, feeling its familiar weight in my palm. She'd worn it for 41 years, through good times and bad, through sickness and health. The idea that Marcus had planned to trade it for cash made my chest tight with rage. "I'm sorry, Daddy. I'm so sorry he took these from you." "You brought them back," I said, slipping Margaret's ring onto my pinky finger where I'd taken to wearing it since her death. "That's what matters." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, sipping our coffee and watching the world wake up outside. Mrs. Henderson was tending her garden next door, and I could hear children playing in the distance, normal sounds of a normal neighborhood on a normal day. "What happens now?" Sarah asked eventually. "Now we live," I said simply. "We rebuild. We remember what family is supposed to look like." Sarah had found a job at the local library. Nothing glamorous, but honest work that gave her satisfaction and independence. She'd rented a small apartment across town, close enough to visit regularly, but far enough away to establish her own life. For the first time since her marriage, she was making decisions based on what she wanted, not what someone else demanded. "I've been thinking about going back to school," she said suddenly. "Maybe taking some business classes, learning about accounting or management." "That sounds wonderful. I want to understand how money works, how contracts work. I never want to be that helpless again." The determination in her voice made me proud. Marcus had tried to turn my daughter into a victim, but he'd failed. She was stronger now, wiser, more careful about who she trusted and why. "Speaking of money," I said, reaching into my shirt pocket, "I have something for you." I handed her an envelope. Inside was a cashier's check for $15,000. "Daddy, I can't take this. It's not a gift," I said. "It's restitution. Marcus stole $60,000 from me, but the court ordered him to pay it back. The first installment came in last week. But you earned this money. You should keep it." "I have everything I need," I said honestly. "What I want is for you to have security. Real security, not the kind that depends on someone else's promises." Sarah stared at the check, tears forming in her eyes. "This is too much. It's not nearly enough to make up for what you've been through, but it's a start." She folded the check carefully and put it in her purse. "I'll put it in savings. Build an emergency fund so I never have to depend on anyone again." Smart girl. As the morning wore on, we talked about everything and nothing. Sarah's job, my garden, plans for Thanksgiving, a book club she was thinking of joining. Normal conversation between a father and daughter who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. Around noon, Sarah gathered her things to leave. She had errands to run, groceries to buy, a life to live. At the door, she hugged me tightly. "I love you, Daddy. Thank you for saving me. I love you too, sweetheart, and you saved yourself. I just gave you the tools." After she left, I returned to my chair and picked up the newspaper again. The article about Marcus's sentencing was short, just a few paragraphs buried among stories about traffic accidents and city council meetings. To most people, it was probably just another crime story. Another bad man getting what he deserved. But to me, it represented something more. It was proof that sometimes the good guys win. Sometimes careful planning and patient execution triumph over greed and violence. Sometimes an old man with a sharp mind and a strong moral compass can protect his family from predators who see kindness as weakness. I thought about Margaret, about what she would have thought of the past year. She'd always been fierce when it came to protecting the people she loved, never hesitating to stand up to bullies or manipulators. I could almost hear her voice. "Harold, you did what you had to do. That man would have destroyed Sarah if you hadn't stopped him." Outside, the afternoon sun was warm and golden, casting long shadows across the yard. I had a book to read, a garden to tend, a quiet evening ahead of me. Sarah would call tonight, as she did every evening now, just to check in and say goodnight. It was a simple life, peaceful and predictable. Some might call it boring. But after a year of manipulation, threats, and violence, boring felt like the greatest luxury imaginable. Marcus was gone, Sarah was safe, and I was free to live out my remaining years surrounded by love instead of lies, generosity instead of greed, family instead of predators. The sun was setting when I finally went inside, but I wasn't afraid of the darkness anymore. Some storms pass, some wounds heal, and sometimes justice arrives exactly when and how it's needed most. I was home, and I was at peace. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.